The Chinese pilot engaged his fire control radar at 1,000 hours over the East Pacific. He believed he was running an intelligence probe. He was delivering a confession. Everything that followed, the 90 seconds of carefully engineered terror, the phantom warship materializing on his radar, the static swallowing his radio, the frantic brake toward home, was a response that had been fully scripted before his J-15 cleared the Liaoning's flight deck. He flew into an ambush dressed as an open sky, and he never knew the difference until it was over. By then, the U.S. Navy knew more about Chinese carrier aviation electronic warfare doctrine than any analyst had been able to derive from satellite imagery and open-source reporting in the previous 3 years. This is how that happened. The J-15D, the electronic attack variant of China's carrier-borne fighter, is not the rough approximation of a Su-33 that Western analysts were dismissing 5 years ago. The current production aircraft carries an active electronically scanned array radar capable of operating in low probability of intercept modes that make its emissions difficult to classify against background noise. Its electronic warfare suite has been refined through successive upgrades based on operational experience in the South China Sea. The 2 aircraft that lifted off from the Liaoning ski jump ramp that morning were crewed by experienced pilots executing a mission that Chinese carrier aviation has run in various forms against Japanese and US Navy assets for years. Approach until a reaction is forced, measure the reaction, extract and analyze. The specific probe in this case was a fire control lock. The lead J-15D pilot rolled his radar from passive search mode to active fire control illumination and painted a Japan Air Self-Defense Force F-15J that was operating on its assigned patrol track in the exercise area. The F-15J's radar warning receiver registered the lock immediately. The frequency, pulse repetition rate, and waveform of a fire control radar are distinct from a search emission and unmistakable to any modern RWR system. The Japanese pilot's cockpit went from routine to high alert in under a second. The Chinese logic was straightforward. A fire control lock on an Allied aircraft is a provocation that demands a response. The response options are limited: break away from the lock, activate countermeasures, or call for defensive support from nearby assets. Each of those responses generates electronic emissions. Those emissions reveal the location, capability, and operating parameters of whatever defensive architecture the Alliance has positioned in the area. The J-15D pilots were not trying to shoot the F-15J. They were trying to make the Americans and Japanese reveal their hand. The hand they were trying to reveal was the EA-18G Growler and the F-35C that both sides understood were operating somewhere in the vicinity. Where exactly, at what altitude, on what emissions profile? That was the intelligence the lock-on was designed to extract. 150 nautical miles from the engagement, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye was orbiting at altitude. Its AN/APY-9 radar painting, a comprehensive air picture that extended well beyond visual range in every direction. The E-2D's crew had the J-15Ds classified and tracked from the moment their radar emissions first appeared over the Liaoning's deck. Before they were airborne, before they had accelerated to operational speed, before the lead pilot's thumb reached the weapons mode selector, the track data had been flowing into the shared tactical picture continuously. And by the time the fire control lock registered on the F-15J's RWR, the E-2D had already queued the network's response. The F-35C and EA-18G Growler were not in the area by coincidence. They had been positioned at a specific geometric point relative to the J-15D's projected approach vector, a location calculated to place their passive sensors in the optimal collection geometry while keeping both aircraft well outside the detection range of the J-15D's radar operating in its expected search mode. Neither aircraft had emitted a single electronic pulse. They had been inhaling the J-15D's radar emissions since the aircraft launched, building a complete electronic profile without providing anything for the Chinese sensors to detect in return. The F-35C's AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda system had, by the time the fire control lock occurred, assembled a targeting quality picture of both J-15Ds based entirely on their own radar and communications emissions. The Chinese pilots' electronic activity had produced a precise map of their own positions. The Hunter had been the most cooperative source of data on itself that a passive collection system could ask for. The first instruction passed from the E-2D to the F-15J was 2 words: hold position. In a conventional tactical scenario, that instruction makes no sense. A pilot with a fire control radar locked onto his aircraft has every reason, procedural, physiological, professional, to respond. breaking the lock geometry, dispensing countermeasures, calling for support. These are the trained responses. Not moving is not in the manual, but the F-15J's pilot held his aircraft exactly where it was, letting the J-15D's fire control radar continue its illumination, presenting a perfectly stationary target for a weapon system that was not being fired, and buying the American network the time it needed to execute the next phase precisely. The Chinese pilots registered the F-15J's complete lack of response with confusion that was visible in their communication pattern. A brief increase in radio traffic between the two aircraft that was being monitored, recorded, and analyzed in real time by the Growler's AN/ALQ-218 receiver system 50 miles away. The lock-on had been designed to force a reaction in under 30 seconds. After 45 seconds of unbroken lock with no Allied countermeasure activity, the Chinese pilots needed new guidance from their ground control element. The lead pilot reached for his communications panel. At that exact moment, the Growler activated. The AN/ALQ-218's electronic attack capability is not a broadband jammer in the Cold War sense. A system that floods a frequency range with noise in the hope that enough power will disrupt enough signals. That approach is effective against unsophisticated receivers and counterproductive against modern systems that use jamming detection as a targeting cue. What the Growler used was a surgical emission, a focused, precisely tuned electronic attack targeted at the specific VHF and HF frequencies the J-15D was using for its data link to the Liaoning's ground control element. Not a noise wall, a targeted interruption of a single communication channel. Inside the Chinese cockpit, the controller's voice, the tactical brain providing situational awareness, guidance, and instruction, dissolved into static mid-sentence. The pilot was not deaf in any general sense. His radar was functioning, his aircraft systems were responsive, but his connection to the command architecture that gave the operation its coherence was severed. He was tactically isolated. What his training told him to do was switch to a backup communication channel, a contingency frequency that his unit's communication security protocol designated for exactly this situation. The Growler was waiting for him to do that. The backup transmission was brief: a check-in call, a request for guidance, a position report. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the Growler's passive receivers cataloged the frequency, modulation type, encryption pattern, and transmission power of a communications channel that had not previously appeared in U.S. Navy signals intelligence databases for this unit. The J-15D pilot had been maneuvered into handing over the one piece of signals intelligence that the lock-on probe was never going to generate on its own. The J-15D pilot still had his radar. He still had the fire control lock on the F-15J. The Japanese aircraft was still holding position, still a clearly defined target in his scope. In the absence of voice guidance, he defaulted to what his instruments told him. He was in a weapons lock on a hostile aircraft. He was attempting to execute his mission. The F-35C made its move. The AN/ASQ-239 does not only collect electronic emissions, it can generate them. Specifically, it can take an intercepted radar signal, modify its characteristics, and retransmit it in a way that inserts false information into the receiving system's picture. The technique is called electronic deception, and its application here was precise. The F-35C took the J-15D's own fire control radar pulses, altered the return timing and amplitude to simulate a large surface contact, and broadcast that manipulated return on a geometry that placed the Phantom directly in the J-15D's rear hemisphere, 12 nautical miles behind the aircraft. The J-15D's radar told its pilot that an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer had appeared at his 6 o'clock. There is no benign interpretation of a surface combatant in close trail at weapons range. An Arleigh Burke carries 96 Mk-41 VLS cells loaded with SM-2 and SM-6 anti-air missiles, whose engagement envelope at that range would place the J-15D inside a hard kill zone within seconds of a launch authorization. The pilot's radar warning receiver was simultaneously generating a threat indication consistent with an Aegis fire control radar, a signal characteristic that the Barracuda had extracted from U.S. Navy training exercises in its intelligence library and was now replaying against the Chinese system's threat classification database. The J-15D pilot's threat picture was now a three-front problem: an unmoving F-15J maintaining fire control lock in front of him, a destroyed communications link to his controller, and an Aegis destroyer with its fire control radar active behind him. Cognitive saturation is not a rhetorical concept in aviation physiology. It is a documented degradation of decision-making capacity that occurs when the volume of high-priority threat inputs exceeds the processing rate of a human operator under stress. The J-15D pilot's training was optimized for a tactical environment with a defined number of concurrent threats, a functioning command link, and a reliable sensor picture. He now had none of those conditions. He broke the lock on the F-15J. The intelligence gathering mission, the entire operational rationale for the probe, was abandoned in under 2 seconds of startled response. His radar shifted to a narrow search beam, sweeping the rear hemisphere for the destroyer that did not exist. His wingmen, receiving no coherent instruction, followed his leader's brake turn. Both aircraft pushed their engines to full afterburner and turned for the Liaoning. The E-2D logged the abort at 1,001 hours and 34 seconds. The engagement from the initial fire control lock to the J-15D's retreat, 94 seconds. The Growler ceased its focused jamming. The F-35C terminated its deception transmission. The Phantom destroyer vanished from the J-15D's radar display between one sweep and the next. The Chinese pilot's cockpit went quiet. No RWR tones, no radar contacts behind him, no threat indicators of any kind. Just afterburner noise and the open ocean ahead. He had no explanation for what had just occurred that his instruments could confirm. The intelligence collected during those 94 seconds was the actual product of the operation, and it ran in one direction. The U.S. Navy had entered the engagement knowing the J-15D's primary radar frequency range and its search mode waveform characteristics. These were already cataloged from prior incidents. It did not know the specific fire control mode parameters the aircraft used when transitioning to weapons lock, because Chinese doctrine kept that transition tight and brief in prior encounters. This engagement provided a full dwell of fire control illumination on a stationary target, long enough for the Barracuda's passive receivers to resolve the complete waveform structure. It also provided the backup communication frequency and encryption pattern for the specific carrier air wing unit involved. And it provided a behavioral data point, the threshold conditions under which J-15D pilots will abandon a primary mission and break for egress, specifically simultaneous communications loss and a rear hemisphere Aegis threat indication within the hard kill envelope. The J-15D pilots returned to the Liaoning with a story that their debrief team would struggle to account for in any conventional tactical framework. A stationary F-15J that refused to respond to a fire control lock, a communications link that died at the critical moment, a destroyer that appeared on radar and then ceased to exist. No sensor data that could be presented as physical evidence of any of it. The U.S. Navy had answers to questions it had been trying to resolve through less direct means for 2 years. The Chinese Air Wing had an incident report that raised more questions than it answered, and a gap in its signals intelligence library where the American system's emission signature should have been. The network never revealed itself. It collected, processed, deceived, and withdrew without producing a single emission that the J-15D's own systems could classify, locate, or counter. The Chinese pilots had been running a probe against a system that was simultaneously running a more sophisticated probe against them, and the only reason they discovered the ambush at all was that the ambush let them go. Consider the scenario where discipline broke and the PL-15 left the rail. The moment a PL-15 was committed, the engagement rules changed. The F-35C's internal weapons bay would have opened and 2 AIM-120D AMRAAMs would have been on their way within seconds of launch detection, not guided by the F-35C's own radar, which remained in standby throughout, but by targeting data flowing continuously from the E-2D Hawkeye's radar through the multifunction advanced data link. The AIM-120D would have flown its entire intercept profile on network data, its own active seeker going live only in the final seconds, too late at the closing velocities involved for the J-15D to develop a useful defensive response. The RWR, warning the Chinese pilot received, would have had no identifiable source. A death sentence delivered by an aircraft he never detected. The PL-15 itself, targeting the F-15J, would have had 40 to 45 seconds of flight time. An SM-2 from an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that the J-15D pilot did not know was in the area would have reached intercept geometry before the Chinese missile reached terminal phase. The J-15D pilot would have watched his weapon destroyed in flight while his own RWR registered a missile launch from a direction his systems had shown as clear. Neither of those events occurred. They did not need to. The engagement had already produced everything the network wanted from it. This is the lesson that Chinese carrier aviation doctrine will need to work through from the debrief data on this incident. A radar lock is not a probe against a point defense. It is a probe against a network. And a network does not respond the way a point defense responds, with localized countermeasures that reveal position and capability. A network responds by treating the probe as data, incorporating it, and using it against the system that generated it. The J-15Ds were not trying to hack a radar. They were trying to hack an ecosystem, and they did not have the right tools for that problem. The question this engagement leaves genuinely unresolved is about the next iteration. China's engineers will study this debrief. The backup frequency compromise means that specific channel is burned and will be replaced. The fire control mode parameters that were collected will at some point be known to have been collected, which means the waveform will be modified. The behavioral data point about the abort threshold will influence future training. How quickly can China's carrier aviation program incorporate the lessons of an engagement it cannot fully explain with evidence it cannot fully trust? And what does the following generation of J-15 electronic warfare capability need to look like to deny the passive collection window that this incident provided? Leave your assessment below.